One, two, three. One, two, three. Do, do, do. Boo. Boo, 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 boo. Boo, 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 boo. Do, 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 do. Alright, looks like it's working. Alright, it sounds actually working. Alright. Going back into things. Doing the good old Federalist Papers again. We are now, I think we're should get to the halfway point tonight, at least. You need a reminder. Federalist Papers, these are the backbone. These are the what Madison and good old Hamilton, from the sing-song man Hamilton. These are what they were writing when the Constitution was written and it was being enacted, and it was trying to convince the states to enact the Constitution. They were going, hey, why should we do this? There's a lot of fighting and getting on, people doing a lot of that stuff. So this was the reaction to that. Or this is the defense of writing the Constitution. And in days like these, it's just good to know what were they thinking when they wrote the Constitution. Like, what were they saying? And what were the defenses of it? Why did they write this and not that? And I think a lot of today is Madison, although most of these are written by Hamilton. Madison is a little harder to read. He likes long run-on sentences and like weird sentence structure, but it's not too bad. What? Could not connect. Reconnecting. Reconnecting? Is it connecting? Okay. No, it seems to be working. Hopefully. Keeps yelling at me that there's a problem, but it seems to be going. Alright. General view of the powers conferred by the Constitution. And these are going to be a lot of comparisons to the Articles of Confederation in comparison to the Constitution that has now been written. The Constitution proposed by the Convention may be considered under two general points of view. All right. The first relates to the sum and quantity of power which vest in the government, including restraints imposed on the states. The second to the particular structure of the government and to the... Did it really disconnect me? No, it's good. It's just yelling at me for no reason. The distribution of this power among the several branches. Under the first view of this subject, two important questions arise. Whether any part of the powers transferred to the general government be unnecessary or improper. Two, whether the entire mass of them be dangerous to the proportion of the jurisdiction left in the several states. Is the aggregate power of the general government greater than ought to have been vested in it? This is the first question. It cannot have escaped those who have attended with candor to the arguments employed against the extensive powers of the government, and that the authors of them have very little considered how far these powers were necessarily means of attaining the necessary end. They have chosen rather than to dwell on the inconveniencies which must be unavoidable, blending with all political advantages, and on the possible abuses which must be incident to the every power or trust, of which a beneficial use can be made. This method of handling the subject cannot impose on the good sense of the people of America. It may display the subtlety of the writer, and may open up the boundless field for rhetoric and declamation. It may inflame the passions of the unthinking. Oh, that's a good line. Inflame the passions of the unthinking. I'm going to try to have to remember that one for the future. And may confirm the prejudices of the misthinking. But cool and candid people will at once reflect that the pursuit of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them, and that the choice must always be made, if not of the lesser evil, at least the greater, not the perfect, good. and that every political institution, a power to advance the public happiness, involves a discretion which may be misapplied and abused. They will see, therefore, that in all cases where power is to be conferred, the point first is to be decided is whether such power be necessary to the public good, as the next will be in case of the affirmative decision. To guard as effectually as possible against the perversions of power, to the public detriment, that we may form correct judgment on this subject, it will be proper to review the several powers conferred on the government of the Union, and it may be more conveniently done. They may be reduced into different classes, and they relate to the following: different objects, security against foreign danger, regulation of intercourse with foreign powers, maintain of harmony and proper intercourse among the states, certain miscellaneous objects of general utility, restraint of the states from certain injurious acts, provisions for giving due efficacy to all these powers. The powers falling within the first class are those of declaring war and granted letters of marque, providing the armies and the fleet. Okay, so he's writing the rules of what does the Constitution actually give the government power to do, of regulating and calling forth the militia, of laying or borrowing money, security against the foreign danger of the primitive objects of civil society. It is avowed and an essential object of the American Union. The powers requisite for attaining it must effectually confined in the federal councils. Is the power of declaring war necessary? No man will answer this question in the negative. It will be superfluous. Therefore, to enter into a proof of affirmative, the existing confederation establishes this power in a most ample form. It is the power of raising armies and equipping fleets necessary. This is involved in the foregoing power. It is involved in the power of self-defense. But was it necessary to give an indefinite power of raising troops, as well as providing fleets and maintaining both in peace as well as in war? The answer to these questions has been anticipated in another place to admit the extensive discussion of them in this place. The answer indeed seems to be obvious and conclusive, and scarcely to justify the discussion in any place. With what color of propriety could this force necessarily for defense be limited by those who cannot limit the force of offense? If a federal constitution could chain the ambition or set the bounds of exertions of other nations, then indeed it might be prudently chain the discretion of its own government, and set the bounds of the exertions for its own safety. How could the readiness for war in the time of peace be safely prohibited, unless we could prohibit it in like manner, the preparations and establishments of every hostile nation? The means of security can only be regulated by the means of the danger of attack. They will, in fact, be ever determined by these rules, and by no others. It is in vain to oppose the constitutional barriers of the impulse of self-defense, self-preservation. It is worse than in vain, because the plants in the Constitution itself necessary usurpations of power, every precedent of which the germ of unnecessary and mutilated repetitions. If one nation maintains constantly a disciplined army, ready for the service and ambition of revenge, it obligates the most passive nations who may be within the reach of enterprise to take corresponding precautions. The 15th century was an unhappy epoch of military establishments in the time of peace. They were introduced by Charles VII of France. All Europeans have followed or been forced into the example, had the example of not being followed by other nations. All Europe must long ago have worn the chains of universal monarch. Were every nation except France now to be disband its peace establishments, the same event might follow. The veteran legions of Rome were an overmatch for the undisciplined valor of all other nations, and rendered her the mistress of the world. Not less the true it was that the liberties of Rome provided the final victim to her military triumphs, and that the liberties of Europe, as far as they ever existed here, have, with few exceptions, been the price of her military establishments. A standing force, therefore, is a dangerous, at the same time that it may be necessary, provision. On the smallest scale, it has its inconveniences. On an extensive scale, its consequences may be fatal. On any scale, it is an object of laudable circumspection and precaution. A wise nation will combine all these considerations, and whilst it does not rashly preclude itself from any resource which may be essential to its safety, will exert all its prudence in diminishing both necessity and the danger of resorting to one which may be inauspicious to its liberties. The clearest marks of this prudence are stamped on the proposed Constitution. The Union itself, which it cements and secures, destroys every pretext for a military establishment which could be dangerous. America united with a handful of troops or without a single soldier exhibits a more forbidding posture to form an ambition than America disunited, with 100,000 veterans ready for combat. It was remarked on a former occasion that the want of pretext has saved the liberties of one nation in Europe, being rendered by her insular situation and her maritime resources impregnable to the armies of her neighbors. The rulers of Great Britain have never been able, by real or artificial dangers, to cheat the public into an extensive peace establishment. The distance of the United States from the powerful nations of the world gives them the same happy security. A dangerous establishment can never be necessary or plausible so as long as they continue a united people, but let it never for a moment be forgotten that they are indebted to this advantage to union alone. The moment of dissolution will be the date of the new order of things. The fears of the weaker or the ambitions of the stronger states or confederacies will set the example of the new as Charles VII did in the Old World. The example will follow here from the same motives which produced universal imitation there, instead of deriving from our situation the precious advantages which Great Britain has derived from hers. The face of America will be but a copy of the continent of Europe. It will present liberty everywhere, crushing between standing armies and perpetual taxes. The fortunes of a disunited America will be even more disastrous than those of Europe. The sources of evil in the letter are confined to her own limits. No superior powers of another quarter of the globe intrigue among her rival nations, inflame their mutual animosities, and render them the instruments of foreign ambition, jealousy, and revenge. In America, miseries springing up from the internal jealousies, contentions, and wars would form a part of her lot. A plentiful addition of evils would have their source in that revelation in which Europe stands to the quarter of the earth, and which no other quarter on earth bears to Europe. This picture of consequences and disunion cannot be too highly colored or too often exhibited. Every man who loves peace, every man who loves his country, every man who loves liberty ought to have ever before his eyes that he may cherish in his heart due to an attachment of the Union of America, be able to set a due value on the means of preserving it. So he's kind of rehashing his defense of the Congress able to raise an army. That was one of the fights that they were having during the Constitution. Next to the effectual establishment of the Union, the best possible precaution against the danger of standing armies is a limitation of the term for which revenue may be approached to their support. The precaution of the Constitution has prudently added, I will not repeat here, for the observations which I flatter myself have placed this subject in a just and satisfactory light. But it may not be improper to take notice of an argument against the part of the Constitution which has been drawn from the policy and practice of Great Britain. It is said that the continuance of an army in that kingdom requires an annual vote of the legislature, whereas the American Constitution has lengthened this period to 2 years. This is the form in which the comparison is usually stated to the public, but is it a just form, a fair comparison? Does the British Constitution restrain the parliamentary discussion to 1 year? Does the American impose on Congress the appropriations for 2 years? On the contrary, it cannot be unknown to the authors of this fallacy themselves that the British Constitution fixed no limit whatsoever to the discretion of the legislator, and the American ties down the legislator to 2 years as the longest admissible term. Had the argument from the British example been truly stated, it would have stood thus. The term for which supplies may be appropriated to the army establishment through unlimited by the British Constitution has nevertheless in practice been limited by parliamentary discretion to a single year. Now, if in Great Britain, where the House of Commons is elected for 7 years, where so great a proportion of the members are elected to such a small proportion of people, whereas the electors are so corrupted by their representatives, and the representatives so corrupted by the crown, the representative body can possess a power to make appropriations to the army for an indefinite term, without desiring or without daring to extend the term beyond a single year. Ought not suspicion herself to blush in pretending that the representatives of the United States, elected freely by a whole body of the people every second year, cannot be safely entrusted with the discretion over such appropriations? Expressly limited to a short period of 2 years, a bad cause seldom fails to betray itself. Of this truth, the management of the opposition to the federal government is unvaried exemplification. But among all the blunders which have been committed, none is more striking than the attempt to enlist on the side of prudent jealousy entertained by the people of standing armies. The attempt has awakened fully the public attention to the important subject, and has led to the investigations which must terminate in through and universal conviction, not only that the Constitution has provided the most effectual guards against the dangers of that quarter, but that nothing short of a Constitution fully adequate to the national defense and preservation of the Union can save America from the many standing armies as it is to be split into states or confederacies. And such a progressive augmentation of these establishments in each as to render them burdensome to the proprieties and ominous to the liberties of the people, as any establishment that can become necessary under a united and efficient government, must be tolerable to the former and safe to the latter. The palpable necessity of power to provide and maintain a navy has protected that a part of the Constitution against a spirit of censure which has spared few other parts. It must indeed be numbered among the greatest blessings of America, that as her union will be the only source of maritime strength, so this will be principal source of her security from the dangers abroad. In this respect, our situation bears another likeness to the insular advantage of Great Britain. The batteries most capable of repelling foreign enterprise on our safety are happily such, and can never be turned a perfidious government against our liberties. The inhabitants of the Atlantic frontier are all of them deeply interested in the provision for naval protection, that hitherto have suffered to sleep quietly in their beds, if the property has remained safe against the predatory spirit and licentious adventures, if their maritime towns have not been compelled to ransom themselves from the terrors of conflagration. By yielding to the exactions and daring and sudden invaders, these instances of good fortune are not to be ascribed to the capacity of the existing government for the protection of those who claims its allegiance, but to causes that are fugitive and fallacious. If we exempt perhaps Virginia and Maryland, which are particularly vulnerable on their eastern fronts, no part of the Union ought to feel more anxious on the subject than New York. Her seacoasts are extensive and very important. A very important district of the state is an island. The state itself is penetrated by large navigable rivers for more than 50 leagues. The great emporium of its commerce and the great reserve of its wealth lies every moment at the mercy of events, and almost as regarded as a hostage for an inglorious compliances with the dictates of a foreign enemy. This is a little bit of exaggeration on his part. New York was so kind of like far away from all the dangers of like a seaborne invasion. Like all the piracy is going to be happening way down south. Like, you know, maybe Canada would come in, but it was also like the most protected. But he is writing this to New York to try to convince them to ratify. So he's kind of being smart with that. Or even the rapturous demands of pirates or barbarians. Should a war be the result of a precarious situation in European affairs, and that all the unruly passions attending to be let loose on the ocean, our escape from insults and depredations, not only on the element, but every part of the bordering on it, will be truly miraculous. In the present conditions of America, the states more immediately exposed to these calamities have nothing to hope from the phantom of a general government which now exists. And if their single resources will equal the task of fortifying themselves against the danger, the object to be protected would be almost consumed by the means of protecting them. The power of regulating and calling forth the militia has already sufficiently vindicated and explained. The power of levying and borrowing money, which the sinew of that which would be exerted in the national defense. It is properly thrown into the same class with it. This power also has been examined already with much attention, and has, I trust, been clearly shown to be necessary. Both the extent and form given to it by the Constitution, I address one additional reflection. Only those who can contend that the power ought to have been restrained to external taxation, by which they mean taxes on articles imported from other countries. It cannot be doubted that this will always be a valuable source of revenue, that it is considerable time it must be a principal source, that at this moment it is an essential one, but we may form very mistaken ideas on this subject if we do not call to mind in our calculations that the extent of revenue drawn from foreign commerce must vary with the variations, both in the extent and the kind of imports, and that these variations do not correspond with the progress of population, which must be the general measure of public wants. That's a bad joke. That's a bad joke. As long as the agriculture continues the sole field of labor, the importation of manufactures must increase as as consumers multiply. As soon as the domestic manufacturers are begun and the hands not called for by agriculture, the imported manufactures will decrease as the number of people increase. In the more remote stages, the imports may consist of a more considerable part of the raw materials. Okay, Madison was not an economist. He did not understand something. Which will be wrought with the articles for exportation, and will therefore require rather incurment of bounties than to be loaded with discouraging duties. A system of government meant for the duration ought to contemplate these revolutions, and be able to accommodate itself to them. Some who have not denied the necessity of power of taxation have grounded a very fierce attack against the Constitution. On the language in which it has defined, it has been urged and echoed that the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, excises, and to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States amounts to an unlimited compensation to exercise every power which may be alleged and necessary for the common defense or general welfare. No stronger proof could be given to the distress under which the writers labor for objections than the stooping to such a misconstruction. Had no other enumeration or definition of the powers of Congress been found in the Constitution, that the general expression just cited the authors of the objection might have had some color to it. Madison using these giant long paragraphs is really frustrating. He really hates breaking up his stuff. Though it would have been difficult to find a reason for so awkward a form of describing the authority to legislate all possible cases, the power to destroy the freedom of the press, trial by jury, or even to regulate the course of descent or all forms of conveyances, must be very singularly expressed by the terms, to raise money for the general welfare. But what color can the objection have when the specification of the objects allude to these great general terms immediately follows? and it is even separated by a longer pause than a semicolon. If the different parts of the same instrument ought to be expounded, as to give meaning to every part which will bear it. Oh, hold on. Shall one part of the same sentence be excluded altogether from the share in its meaning, and shall the more doubtful and indefinite terms be retained in their full extent, and the clear and precise expressions be denied any signification whatsoever? For what purpose could the enumeration of particular powers be inserted, if these and all others were meant to be included in the preceding general powers? Nothing is more natural nor common than the first use of the general phrase, and then to explain and qualify it by recital of particulars. But the idea of enumeration of the particulars which neither explains nor qualify the general meaning, that can have no other effect than to confound and mislead, is an absurdity, which, as we are reduced to the dilemma of charging either the authors of the objection or the authors of the Constitution, we must take the liberty of supposing, had its not origin with the latter. The objection here is the more extraordinary as it appears that the language used in the conversation is a copy from the Articles of Confederation. The objects of the Union among the states, as described in the Article 3rd, are their common defense, security of liberties, mutual and general welfare. The terms of the Article 8th are still more identical. All charges of war and all other expenses that shall be incurred from common defense or general welfare are allowed by the United States Congress shall be defrayed out of the common treasury, etc. A similar language again occurs in the 9th. Construction either of these articles are to rule which would justify the construction put on the new Constitution. They vest the existing Congress a power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. But what would have been thought of that assembly if, attacking themselves to the general expression, and disregard the specifications which assertion and limit their import, they have exercised an unlimited power of providing for the common defense and general welfare? I appeal to the objectors themselves, whether they would in cases have employed the same reasoning in their justifications of Congress, as they now make a use against the convention. How difficult is it for error to escape its own commendation? All right, that's 41. Or no, yeah, that's 41. What's the stream's awesome? Real. Oh. How's it going? What's up, RD? All right. Well, that's number 41. We got just... I need to get through... I need to get to 43 tonight. I need to get to the halfway point. It's been so long since I hit the halfway point. And I feel like this is taking too long to get through all these. (42) The powers conferred by the Constitution further considered. Madison. The second class of powers lodged in the general government consist of those which regulate the intercourse with foreign nations, to wit, to make treaties, to send and receive ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, to define and punish piracy and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the law of nation, to regulate foreign commerce, including a power to prohibit, after the year of 1808, the importation of slaves, and to lay intermediate duty of $10 per head as a discouragement of such importations. This class of powers forms an obvious and essential branch of the federal administration. If we are to be one nation in any respect, it is clearly ought to be in respect to other nations. Madison was one of the camp that thought that slavery was just kind of going away on its own. He was like, hey, if we just make this part of the Constitution, after 1808, no more slavery, we'll stop importing them, we'll start taxing it, and it'll just kind of go away on its own. They didn't have the forethought. You can say they were being a little overly optimistic, or how could they have known? It's hard to say. It kind of depends on your opinion of like how profitable slavery was going to become in the Union. Maybe they would have taken a different tact or not, but a lot of them really thought like this thing was going away on their own. Some people still really wanted it really bad. Others really wanted to go away, and then there was kind of this third camp, which was kind of the biggest camp, really, of this thought, oh, that slavery thing, it's just a fad. It's going away. The powers to make treaties and to send and receive ambassadors speak their own propriety. Both of them are compromised in the Articles of Confederation, with this difference only, that the former is disembarrassed by the plan of the convention, and of an exception under which treaties might be substantially frustrated by regulations of the states, and the power of appointing and receiving other public ministries and consuls is expressly and very properly added to the former provision of concerning ambassadors. The term ambassador, if taken strictly, as it seems to be required by the Second Articles of Confederation, comprehends the highest grade only for public ministers, and excludes the grades which the United States will be most likely to prefer. Where foreign embassies may be necessary, and under no latitude of construction will the term comprehend consuls, yet it has been found expedient, and that has been the practice of Congress, to employ the inferior grades of public ministries to send and receive consuls. It is true that there were treaties of commerce stipulated for the mutual appointment of consuls whose functions are connected with commerce. The administration of foreign consuls may fall within the power of making commercial treaties, and that where no such treaties exist, the mission of American consuls into foreign countries may perhaps be covered under the authority given by the 9th Article of the Confederation, to appoint all such civil officers as may be necessary for managing the general affairs in the United States. But the admission of consuls in the United States, where no previous treaty has stipulated it, seems to have been nowhere provided for. A supply of a mission is the one of lesser instances in which the convention have improved the model before them. But the most minute provisions become important when they tend to obviate the necessity for the pretext of gradual and unobserved usurpations of power. A list of cases in which Congress have been betrayed or forced by the defects of the Confederation into violations of their chartered authorities would not a little surprise those who have paid no attention to the subject, and would be inconsiderable argument in favor of the new Constitution, which seems to have provided no less studiously for the lesser than the more obvious and striking defects of the old. The power to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the law of nations, belongs with equal priority to the general government, and is still greater improvement on the Articles of Confederation. The Articles contain no provision for the case of offenses against the law of nations, consequently leave it in the power of any indiscreet member to embroil the Confederacy with foreign nations. The provision of the federal articles on the subject of piracy and felonies extends no further than the establishment of courts for the trial of these offenses. The definition of piracy might perhaps without inconveniency be left to the law of nations. Through a legislative definition for them is found the most municipal codes. Oh, thanks. Oh, thanks for the medal thing. That's awesome. Thank you. The definition of felonies on the high seas is evidently requisite. Felony is a term of loose Which would you choose, communism or capitalism? Uh, it, what is your definition of those things? People have very different definitions of those things. A definition of felonies on the high seas is evidently requisite. Felony is a term of loose signification, even in the common law of England and the various import of the statute laws of the kingdom. But neither is the common nor the statute law or any other nation ought to be a standard for the proceeding of this, unless previously made by the own legislator of adoption. The meaning of the term, as defined in the codes of the several states, would this be as impracticable as the former, as would be dishonorable and the illegitimate. It is not precisely the same in any two states that the varies of each with every revision of its criminal laws. For the sake of certainty and uniformity, therefore, defining felonies in this case, in every respect necessary and proper. The regulation of foreign commerce, having fallen within the several views which have been taken on the subject, has been fully discussed to need an additional proofs here of being properly submitted to the federal administration. It were doubtless to be wished that the power of prohibiting and the importation of slaves not be postponed until the year 1808, or rather that had been suffered to have been immediate operation, but it is not difficult to account either for the restriction or general government for the manner which this whole clause express. It ought to be considered as a great point gained in favor of humanity that a period of 20 years may terminate forever within these states, a traffic which has so long and loudly upbraided the barbarism of modern policy, that within that period it will receive a considerable discouragement from the federal government, and may be totally abolished by the concurrence of a few states which continue the unnational traffic, the prohibited example which has been given so great a majority in the Union. Happy would it be for the unfortunate Africans if this equal prospect lay before them by redeeming from the oppositions of their European brethren. This is a lot. You don't hear about this a lot, but yeah, like Madison was definitely in this camp. He was like, hey, we put in the Constitution, there's going to be no more slavery in 20 years. He was completely convinced that that Article 1 section, that the ban of the importation was just going to deal with it. Then like, we're going to tax it and it's going to just go away. If he had known just how profitable it was to come, I feel like definitely Madison or Hamilton, both of them would have been have a lot more strict or intense banning on slavery than they thought was necessary. Their idea of this banning on importation, that it was just going to work. I really wonder like if they could go back, if they would. If you want to come back and when I'm doing like when we did the Econ 101 stream, we're going to talk about that. But we're doing Constitution stuff today. I'm not a communist. I'm not a strict capitalist either. But we can talk about that another time. Attempts have been made to pervert this clause into the object against the Constitution by representing it on one side as a criminal toleration of illicit practice, on the other as calculated to prevent voluntary and beneficial immigrations from Europe to America. I mention these misconstructions not with a view to give them an answer, for they deserve none, but the specimens of the manner of this spirit in which some have thought it fit to conduct their opposition to the proposed government. The powers included in the third class are those which have provided the harmony and improper intercourse among the states. Under his head, it might be included the particular restraints imposed on the authority of the states, and certain powers of the judicial department, but the former reserved for the distinct class. And the latter will be particularly examined when we arrive in the structure and organization of the government. I shall confine myself to a sensory review of the remaining powers comprehended under this third description, to wit, to regulate commerce among the several states and the Indian tribes, to coin money, to regulate the value therefore, and of foreign coin, to provide for the punishments of counterfeiting, and the current coin and the securities of the United States, to fix the standard of weights and measures, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization, a uniform laws of bankruptcy, and to describe the manner in which the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of each state shall be provided, and the effect they shall have in the other states, and to establish post offices and post roads. The defective power of the existing confederation to regulate commerce between its several members is in the number of those into which it is clearly pointed out by experience. The proofs and remarks which the former papers have brought into view of the subject, it may be added that with the supplemental provision, the great and essential power of regulating foreign commerce would have been incomplete and ineffectual. A very material object of this power was the relief of the states which import and export through the states, and the improper contributions levied on them by the latter. Were these liberties to regulate the trade between state and state, it must be foreseen that the ways we would be found out to load the articles of import and export during the passage through the jurisdictions with duties which would fall on the makers of the latter and the consumers of the former. We may be assured by past experience that such a practice would be introduced by future contrivances, and that both by that and the common knowledge of human affairs that would nourish the unceasing animosities and not the improbable terminate for serious interruptions of the public tranquillity. To those who do not view the question through a medium of passions of interest, the desire of commercial states to collect in any form an indirect revenue from the uncommercial neighbors must appear not less impolitique than it is unfair, since it would stimulate the injured party by resentment as well as interest to resort to the less convenient channels of their foreign trade. Oh, God, Madison. Why are his paragraphs so long? It's hard to take a break. But the mild voice of reason pleading with the cause of enlarged and permanent interest is but too often drowned before public bodies as well as individuals by the clamors of impatient avidity for immediate and immoderate gain. The necessity of superintending authority over the reciprocal trade of confederated states has been illustrated by other examples as well as our own. In Switzerland, where the union is so very slight, each canton is obligated to allow merchandises a passage through the jurisdiction into other cantons without augmentation of the tolls. In Germany, it is the law of the empire that the princes and the states shall not lay tolls or custom on bridges, rivers, or passages without the consent of the emperor and the diet. Diet is like their, not Congress, but their parliament, though it appears from quotation of an anodite paper that this practice is in any other instances of that confederacy, has not followed the law, and has produced there the mischiefs which has been foreseen here. Among the restraints imposed on the Union of the Netherlands on its members, one is they shall establish impost disadvantages to their neighbors without the general permission. The regulation of commerce within the Indian tribes is very properly unfettered from two limitations in the Article of Confederations, which render the provisions obscure and contradictory. The power is there restrained to the Indians not members of any states, and is not to violate or to infringe legislative right of any of the states within its own limits. What description of Indians are to be deemed members of a state, it is not yet settled, and has been a question of frequent perplexity and contention in the federal councils. And how trade with Indians, though not members of the state, yet residing within the legislative jurisdiction, can be regulated by an external authority, without so far intruding on the internal rights of legislation, is absolutely incomprehensible. It is not only the case in which the Articles of Confederation have inconsiderably endeavored to accomplish impossibilities, to reconcile a partial sovereignty in the Union with a complete sovereignty in the states, to subvert a mathematically axiom by taking a way apart and letting the whole remain. All that needs to be remarked on the powers to coin money, regulate the value therefore, of foreign coin is the providing this last case. The Constitution has supplied a material omission to the Articles of Confederation. The authority of the existing Congress restrained to the regulation of coins struck by their own authority or that of the respective states. It must be seen at once that the proposed uniformity in the value of the current coin might be destroyed by subjugating that of foreign coin to the different regulations of the different states. The punishment of counterfeiting the public securities as well as the current coin is submitted, of course, to the authority which it is secure to the value of both. The regulation of weights and measures is to be transferred from the Articles of Confederation and is founded on the like considerations with the preceding power of regulating coin. Whew. The dissimilarity in the rules of naturalization has long remarked as fault in our system, and that laying the foundation for intricate and delicate questions. In the 4th article of the Confederation, it is declared that the free inhabitants of each of these states, paupers, vagabonds, fugitives from justice, exempted, shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of free citizens. In the several states, the people of each state shall in other enjoy the privileges of trade and commerce, etc. There is a confusion of language here, which is remarkable. Why the terms of free inhabitants are used in one part of the article, free citizens in another, and people in another. What is meant by superseding all privileges and immunities of free citizens? All the privileges and trade of commerce cannot easily be determined. It seems to be constructed scarcely avoidable, however, that those who come under the domination of free inhabitants of a state, although not citizens of the state, are entitled in every other state to be privileges of free citizens of the latter, that is, to greater privileges than may be entitled of their own state. Oh, this is kind of interesting. Like, I've never heard them, like, they kind of, like, gesture at the Articles of Confederation. Never heard them really quote it and go, look how stupid this is. So that it might be the power of a particular state, or rather that every state is laid under the necessity not only confer the rights of the citizenships of other states upon whom it may admit such rights without itself, but upon any whom have allowed become inhabitants within the jurisdiction, but were exposed of the term inhabitants to be admitted, which would confine and stipulated privileges to citizens alone. The difficulty is diminished only, not removed. The very improper power which retained by each state of naturalizing aliens in other states. In one state, residences for a short term confers all the rights of citizenship. In another, qualifications of greater importance are required. An alien, therefore, legally incapacitated for certain rights in the latter, may, by previous residence only in the former, elude this incapacity, and thus the law of one state to be preposterly rendered paramount to the law of another. Within the jurisdiction of another, we owe to the mere casualty that the very serious embarrassments on this subject have been hitherto escaped by the laws of several states. Certain descriptions of aliens who have rendered themselves obnoxious or laid under interdicts inconsistent not only with the rights of citizenship, but with the privilege of residence. What would have been consequence if such persons, by residence or otherwise, have acquired the character of citizens under the law of another state, and then asserted their rights as such, of both resident and citizenship, within the state subscribing them? So he's just really going in on the articles here, like how stupid they are. Whatever the legal consequences might have been, the other consequences probably would have resulted of too serious a nature not to be provided against. The new Constitution, accordingly, with great property, made provisions against them, and that all other proceedings from the defect of the Confederation on this head, by authorizing the general government to establish a uniform rule of naturalization throughout the states. The power of establishing uniform laws of bankruptcy is so intimately connected with the regulation of commerce and will prevent so many frauds where their parties of property may lie and they are moved to the different states, and that the expediency of it seems not likely to be drawn in question. The power prescribing by general laws the manner in which the public acts, records, or judiciary proceedings of each state shall be provided, and that the fact that they shall have other states is an evident valuable improvement on the clause relating to such subjects of the Articles of Confederation. The meanings of the latter is extremely indeterminate and can be of little importance under the interpretation which it may bear. The power here established may be rendered to the very convenient instrument of justice, and may be a particular benefit of the borders of the contiguous states, where the effects liable to justice may suddenly be secretly translated. In any stage of the process with foreign jurisdiction, the power of establishing post roads must in every view be harmless power, and may perhaps, by judicious management, become productive of a great public conveniency. Nothing which tends to facilitate the intercourse between states can be deemed unworthy of the public care. Publius. Oh, man. He really can ramble. Madison he just has these long paragraphs. All right. It's late, but I want to get to the halfway point of the... So I'm going to do one more. We're going to do it. All right. The same subject continued. The powers conferred to the Constitution further considered. James Madison, people of New York. The fourth class compromises the following miscellaneous powers: a power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. The utility of this power will scarcely be questioned. The copyright of authors has been solemnly adjudicated in Great Britain to be a right of common law. The right of useful innovation seemed with equal reason to belong to the inventors. So this is the only part in the entire Articles of Confederation where they talk about this clause, about copyright and, exclusive rights and things like that, of rights of the people, of their creators to keep them. The public good fully coincides in both cases with the claims of individuals. The states cannot separately make effectual provisions for either cases, and the most of them have anticipated the decision on this point by laws passed in the instances of Congress. 2. To the exercises exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such districts not exceeding 10 miles square as may be the secession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of government. He's talking about Washington, D.C. And to exercise the like authority of all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the states, which the same shall for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. The indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. It is the power exercised by every legislator of the Union, and might say of the world, by virtue of general supremacy. Without it, not only the public authority might be insulated by its proceedings interrupted with the impunity, but with dependence of the members of the general government. Oh, what did that say? The general government of the state, comprehended to the seat of government for protection in the exercise of duty, might bring the national councils of imputation of all of influence or equal dishonorable to the government of dissatisfactory to the other members of the Confederacy. This consideration has more weight as the gradual accumulation of public improvements at the stationary residence of government would be both too great a public pledge to be left in the hands of a single state, and would create so many obstacles to removal of the government, and still further, a bridge of necessary independence. The extent of the federal district is sufficiently circumscribed to satisfy every jealousy of an opposite nature, and as to be appropriated to this with the consent of the state ceding it, as the state will no doubt provide in the compact for the rights and consent of the citizens inhabiting it. As for the inhabitants will find sufficient inducements interested in becoming willing parties to the secession, and will have their voice in the election of the government, which is to exercise authority over them as a municipal legislator for local purposes. Derived from their own suffrages will of course be allowed them, and with the authority of the legislative state and to the inhabitants of the ceded part to concur in the secession will be derived from the whole people of the state in the adoption of the Constitution. Every imaginable objection seems to be obviated. The necessity of the like authority over forts, magazines, etc., established by the general government is not less evident. The public money expended on such a place and the public property deposited in them requires that they should be exempt from the authority of the particular state. Nor would it be proper for the places on which the security of the entire Union may depend to be any degree dependent on a particular member of it. All objections and scruples here have been obviated by requiring the concurrence of the state concerned. This is one's like he's just like going over of like why DC became how and like the compromises between DC, which is a little boring. DC originally was supposed to be a perfect square, but there was like Virginia was being a little baby about things. To declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work the corruption of blood and forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted. As treason may be committed against the United States, the authority of the United States ought to be enabled to punish it, as by newfangled and artificial treasons have been the great engines by which violent factions, the natural offsprings of free government, have usually wreaked their alternative malignity on each other. And the convention have with great judgment opposed the barrier to this particular danger, by inserting a constitutional definition of crime, fixing the proof of necessity for conviction of it, restraining Congress even in punishing it, from extending the consequences of guilt beyond the person of its author, to admit new states into the Union, but no state shall be formed or erected with the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state shall be formed by the junction of two or more states, or parts of states, without the consent of the legislator of the states concerned, as well as by Congress. In the Articles of Confederation, no provision is found on this important subject. Canada was to be admitted of right on her joining in the measures of the United States and the other colonies, by which were evidently meant the other British colonies at the discretion of the 9 states, but eventually establishment of new states seems to have been overlooked by the compilers of that instrument. We have seen that the inconvenience of this omission and the assumption of power into which Congress has been led by it with great propriety, therefore, and the new system supplied the defect. The general precaution that no state shall be formed without the concurrence of the federal authority and of the states concerned, it is consistent with the principles that ought to have governed such transactions. The particular precaution against the erection of new states by the partition of a state without its consent quiets the jealousy of the larger states, as the smaller is quieted by the like precaution against the junction of states without their consent. 5. To dispose of and to make of the needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States, with a proviso that nothing in the Constitution shall be constructed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. This power, of great importance and required by the considerations similar to those which show the priority of the former, the proviso annexed is properly itself, and the probability rendered absolutely necessary by jealousness and questions of concerning the Western territories sufficiently known to the public, to guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government to protect each of them against invasion and the application of the legislator or from the executive, when the legislator cannot be convened, against domestic violence or violation. In the Confederacy, founded on Republican principles and composed of Republican members, the superintending government ought to clearly to possess authority to defend against the system of aristocratic and monarchical inventions. The more intimate and nature of such a union may be, the greater interest have the members of the political institutions of each other, and that the greater right to insist that the forms of government under the compact has entered should be substantially maintained. But a right implies a remedy, and where else could be a remedy be deposited than where it is and where else could the remedy be deposited than where it is deposited by the Constitution? Governments of dissimilar principles and forms have been found less adapted by the federal coalition of any sort than that of a kindred nature. As the Confederate Republic of Germany, says Montesquieu, consists of free cities and petty states, subject to different principles. Experience shows us that it is more imperfect than the acts of Holland or Switzerland. Greece was undone, he adds, as soon as the king of Macedon obtained a seat among the Amphicians. In the later case, no doubt, the disproportionate force as well as the monarchical form of the new confederate has a share of influence on its events. It may possibly ask, what need is there would be such a precaution, whether it not become the pretext for the alliterations in the state governments, without the concurrence of the state governments themselves? These questions admit ready answers. If the interposition of the general government would not be needed, then provision for such an event will be harmless and superfluity only in the Constitution. But who can say what experiments may be produced by the caprice of particular states, by the ambition of enterprising leaders, or by the intrigues and influence of foreign powers? To the second question, it may be answered that if the general government should be interposed by virtue of this constitutional authority, it will be, of course, bound to pursue the authority. But the authority extends no further than the guarantee of a republican form of government, which supposes a pre-existing government of the form to which it to be guaranteed. As long, therefore, as the existing republican forms are continued by the states, they are guaranteed by the federal constitution. Whether the states may choose to substitute other republican forms, they have a right to do so, and the claims of the federal guarantee for the latter. The only restriction imposed on them is that they shall exchange republican for an anti-republican constitutions, a restriction which, it is presumed, will hardly be considered as a grievance. Oh, this is still so much more. Why is this paragraph so long? Oh, what did I just click? I didn't mean to do that. Okay. A protection against invasion is due from every society to the parts composing it. The latitude of the expression here seems to be secure each state, not only against foreign hostility, but against ambitious and vindictive enterprises of more powerful neighbors. The history, both of ancient and modern confederation, proves that the weaker members of the Union ought not be insensible to the policy of this article. Protection against domestic violence is added with equal propriety. It has been remarked that even among the Swiss cantons, which properly speaking are not under one government, provision is to be made for this object, and that the history of this league informs us that the mutual aid is frequently claimed and afforded, as well as by the most democratic as well as the other cantons. A recent and well-known event among ourselves has warned us to be prepared for emergencies of a like nature.
At first view, it may seem not to square with the Republican theory to suppose either that the majority have not the right or the minority will have the force to subvert the government, and consequently that the federal imposition can never be required but when it would be improper. The theoretic reasoning in this is, as most other cases, will be qualified by the lessons of practice. Why may not illicit combinations for the purposes of violence be formed as well as by a majority of state, especially of a small state, by a majority of the country, or by a district of the same state? And if the authority of the state ought, in the latter case, to protect the local magistrate, ought to not the federal authority, in the former to support the state authorities. Besides, there are certain parts of the state constitutions which are so interwoven with the federal constitution that a violent blow cannot be given to the one without communicating the wound to the other. Insurrections in a state will rarely introduce a federal imposition unless the number concerned in them will bear some proportion to the friends of government. It will be much better than the violence in such cases should be repressed by the superintending power than the majority should be left to maintain their cause by bloody and obstinate contest. The existence of a right to interpose will generally prevent the necessity of exerting it. It is true that the force and the right are necessarily on the same side of republican governments. May not the minority party possess such a superiority, perfunctory resource of military talents and experience, or of secret successors from foreign powers, as well as render it superior to an appeal of the sword? May not more compact and advantageous position turn to the scale of the same side against a superior member than to be situated as to be less capable of a prompt and collected exertion of its strength? Nothing can be more chimerical than to imagine the trial of actual force. Victory may be calculated by the rules which prevail in the census of inhabitants, or which determines the event of an election. It may happen again and find that the minority of citizens become a majority of persons, and by the accession of alien residents of a casual concourse of adventurers, or to those whom the Constitution of States has not admitted to the rights of suffrage. I take no notice of the unhappy species of population abounding in some of the states, who during the calm of regular government are sunk below the level of men, who in the tempestuous scenes of civil violence may emerge into human character, and give a superiority of strength to any party which one may associate themselves. In cases where it may be doubtful on which side of justice lies, what better umpires could be desired by two violent factions, flying to arms and tearing a state to pieces, than the representatives of Confederate states, not heated by local flame? To the impartiality of judges, they would unite the affection of friends. Happy would be such the remedy of infirmities could enjoy by all free governments. If a project equally effectual could be established for the universal peace of mankind, should it be asked, what is the redress for the insurrection pervading all the states, and compromising the superiority of the entire force? Though not a constitutional right, the answer must be that such a case as it be within to compass the human remedies, it is fortunate not within the compass of human probability, and that it is a sufficient recommendation of the federal constitution, that it diminishes the risk of calamity for which no possible constitution can provide a cure. Among the advantages of a Confederate Republic enumerated by Montesquieu, an important one is, they should a popular insurrection happen in one of the states, the others are able to quell it. Should abuse creep into one part, they are reformed by those of the that remain sound. 7. To consider all debts contracted, the engagements entered into before the adoption of the Constitution being as less valid against the United States under this Constitution than under the Confederation. This can be only considered as a declaratory proposition that may have inserted, among other reasons, for the satisfaction of the foreign creditors of the United States. who cannot be strangers to the pretended doctrine that changes the political I just lost my spot completely. Go back a little bit. Among the lesser criticisms which has been exerted by the Constitution, it is remarked that the validity of engagement ought to have been asserted in favor of the United States as well as against them, and in this spirit would usually characterizes little critics. Girl, don't do that on camera. As well as against them, and that the spirit of which usually characterized little critics. The omission has been transformed and magnified into a plot against the national rights. The authors of this discovery have been told what few others need to be informed of, that as engagements are in their natural reciprocal, an assertion of their validity on one side necessarily involves the validity of the other side, and the article merely declaratory. The establishment of principle on one case is sufficient in every case. They may be further told that in every constitutional limit the precautions to danger are not altogether imaginary, and that no real danger can exist than the government would dare, with or even without it. The constitutional declaration before it to remit the debts justly to the due public, and the pretexts here condemned. 8. To provide the amendments to be ratified by 3/4 of the states under the 2 exceptions only, the useful alterations be suggested by experience, not to be foreseen. It is requisite, therefore, that a mode of introducing them should be provided. The mode preferred by the convention seems to be stamped by every mark of propriety. It guards equally against the extreme felicity to which it would render the Constitution too mutable, and that the extreme difficulty which may perpetuate its difficulties faults. Moreover, equally enables the general and state governments to originate the amendment errors, and may be pointed out as the experience on one side or the other. The exception in this favor of equality of suffrage in the state was probably meant as a palladium to the residuary sovereignty of the states, implied and secured of the principles representation of one branch of the legislature, and was probably insisted on by the states of particularly attached to that equality. The other exception must be admitted that the same considerations which produced the privilege defended it. 9. The ratification of the conventions of the 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution of the states. Ratifying the same article speaks for itself. The express authority of the people alone could give the due validity of the Constitution. To have required the unanimous ratification of 13 states would have subjected the essential interest of the whole caprice or corruption of a single member. It would have marked a want of foresight in the convention, which our own experience would have rendered inexcusable. 2 questions of a very delicate nature present themselves on this occasion. 1. On what principle does the confederation, which stands the solemn form of compact among the states, can be superseded without the unanimous consent of the parties to it? What relation is this subset between the 9 or more states ratifying the Constitution, and remains few who do not become parties of it? The first question is answered by one of the recurring and absolute necessity in the case, the great principles of self-preservation to the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God, which declares that the safety and happiness of societies are the objects at which the political institutions aim, and to which the institutions must be sacrificed. Perhaps also an answer may be found, without searching beyond the principles of the compact itself. It has been hitherto noted among the defects of the Confederation that the many states it has received no higher sanction than the mere legislative ratification. The principle of reciprocity seems to be required that the obligation of the other states should be reduced to the same standard. A compact between the independent sovereigns founded in the ordinary acts of the legislative authority can pretend no higher validity than the league or treaty between the parties. It is an established doctrine on the state subject of treaties that the articles are mutually conditions of each other, and that the breach of any one article is a breach of the whole treaty, and the breach committed by either of the parties absolves all the others. The and authorizes them, if they please, to pronounce the compact violated and void. Should it be unhappy and necessary to appeal the delicate truths for the justification of dispensing with the consent of the particular states to a dissolution of the federal pact, will not the complaining parties find that the diplomat's answer be manipulated and important infractions with which they were confronted? The time has been, within the incumbent on all of us, the veil of ideas which this paragraph exhibits, this very long paragraph. The scene is now changed, that with the part which has the same motives to dictate, the second question is not less delicate, that the flattering prospect has been merely hypothetical, forbids the over-curious discussion of it. It is one of the cases which must be left to provide it itself. In general, it must be observed that although no political relation can subsist between the asserting and disasserting states, yet the moral relations will remain uncancelled. The claims of justice both on one side and the other will be enforced and must be fulfilled. The rights of humanity must in all cases duly and mutually respected, while considerations of a common interest, and above all the remembrance and endurance scenes which are past, and the anticipation of a speedy triumph over the obstacles of a reunion, will of hopes not urged with vain moderation on one side and prudence on the other. Publius. All right. That is now the halfway point of all the Federalist Papers. I'm losing my voice after Madison's, because all of his ones are freaking long run-on sentences. It's hard to take a breath. But I think I'm done for the night. I'm going to try again to hit this up tomorrow. If not, I will be back next week. Hope everyone has a really good night. If you got anything out of this, throw me a follow. I'd appreciate it. It'd be real cool. Love you guys. I hope everyone has a really good night.